Actually, more than that, I've been an active participant in the website Forgotten New York, founded by Kevin Walsh in 1997, a website which later became a book, which later led to a series of tours and lectures throughout bookstores, libraries, and universities, mostly for Kevin and a little bit for me. In this video, I'd like to share some of my recent photo essays, which highlight some of the hidden details of New York City. The most recent one was in the end of December 2023, when I took readers to the East River Greenway, an offshore walkway next to the FDR Drive past the Sutton Place neighborhood on the east side of Midtown. It includes the site of a heliport that was named after Andrew Haswell Green, known as the father of the New York City's expansion when the other boroughs joined Manhattan to create Greater New York, as well as the history of the cliffs and the brownstones and breweries along Sutton Place before it became an expensive neighborhood. Before that, we went to Liberty Island, where everybody knows the story of the statue that was given to the United States by the French, and a few people might know about the pedestal structure designed by Richard Morris Hunt, the architect of the Metropolitan Museum, but fewer people know about the 11-pointed star on which the pedestal stands. That is Fort Wood, named after Colonel Eleazar Wood, who was killed in the War of 1812. You can still find small pieces of Fort Wood. For example, the arch when you walk down the stairs from the platform on top of the fort, as well as an emergency exit leading from this fort, where I found a photo of a tunnel that used to be inside Fort Wood before there was Statue of Liberty. Beyond that, earlier in the year, we also went to the site of the Essex Market, which began as a retail market on Essex Street by Ludlow Street, and then moved to the corner of Essex and Delancey in the 1930s, and then relocated in this new millennium to its present location, a mixed-use building on a corner of Essex and Delancey on the southern side of Delancey. In this photo essay, I talk about the Seward Park urban renewal area, dozens of tenements knocked down that were supposed to be replaced with Le Corbusier-style towers in the park, similar to the Seward Park co-ops and the housing projects next to it. But the project was stalled until the early part of this millennium, when the new buildings started to go up. On this photo, the title photo of the essay, the corner of Norfolk Street and Broome Street is the site of the Beis Medrash Hagadol, synagogue that was home to the first and last chief rabbi of New York City. By the 1970s, the Jewish community on the Lower East Side was declining, the synagogue fell into ruins, and was then burned by an arsonist. It was replaced by an apartment building, but its location is forever remembered by those who appreciate Jewish history in New York City. Old and New in Far Rockaway. In this essay, the site of a rail yard that became a shopping strip mall that was then demolished to make way for this urban renewal project, a mixed income, mixed use development, and a new street called Village Road. This essay points out a period of time before 1898, when Far Rockaway was an incorporated village before it became a neighborhood within Queens, New York. In this photo essay, I visit the invisible and undefended boundary line where Inwood becomes Far Rockaway. Inside, Outside, Sunnyside. That was Kevin's idea. My title for this essay would have been Sunny Came Home. When I had to take a car for repair to Major World, the auto dealer on the border of Sunnyside and Woodside, while waiting for the car to be repaired, I strolled around the neighborhood and visited some of the apartment building lobbies showing the Art Moderne, Georgian-inspired, and Art Deco styles of the elevators and lobbies in an essay on Sunnyside, Queens. Changing Battery, a nice punny title on Battery Park. One of the few parks in New York City that's older than Central Park. This park's history goes back to the early years of American independence, when President Washington strolled along its waterfront. In this essay, I point out nearly 2 centuries of changes to the park's design, the history of Castle Clinton, the fortress that became a concert hall, that became an aquarium, an immigration terminal, and then a museum, along with proposals for the park that were unrealized, like a giant obelisk and a Brooklyn Battery Bridge, as well as a painting of the park made by a Russian diplomat in the 1820s. Across the street from Battery Park, the U.S. Customs House and home the Smithsonian Native American Museum stands on the site of Fort Amsterdam, which later became known as Fort George and Fort James after the English kings. Demolished after the Revolution, it was briefly the site of Government House when New York was the federal capital, and then demolished to make way for townhouses. It was during that period, around 1816, that a dead-end street inside this block called Whitney Street, named after a property owner, appeared on the maps. In this essay, I talk about what happened to Whitney Street. Today, just a driveway going into the Customs House. The Forgotten Met, one of the largest art museums in the world, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, has its Renaissance Revival facade by Richard Morris Hunt. But in this essay, I point out nearly 20 times that this building has expanded from its original Victorian Gothic frame. And when you go inside, you could find elements of the buildings inside the building, as well as the unrealized designs for this museum, such as an automobile ramp or the elimination of the grand staircase. Thankful those didn't happen. On the essay of the Forgotten Met. Shea on the map. A lot of us know about Shea Stadium, which was the home of the New York Mets baseball team from 1962 till around 2010, was it? Yeah, 2010. And now home to Citi Field. But there are two places on the map where you could still find the name of Bill Shea, the lawyer who brought the National League back to New York City. The Long Island Railroad Shea substation, an electric power station next to the train tracks, short walk from the stadium, and Shea Road, which looks like a parkway ringing around the parking field of Citi Field. And inside Citi Field is the industrial-style Shea Bridge, a charming piece of history that really is post-millennial behind the outfield, as well as the Flushing Meadows garage of the Parks Department, one of the few buildings in the park dating back to 1939 World's Fair. Printers Park. In the Hunts Point neighborhood of the South Bronx, there's a street called Hoe Avenue, and near it is Gutenberg Street. These streets were named after people relating to the history of typewriting and printing. And in Printers Park, the New York City Parks Department created play equipment that looks like rolls of paper. So in this essay, I talk about the history of this neighborhood, how it went from apartment buildings to the distress of the 1970s and 80s with the empty lots and the crime, and then the urban renewal that resulted in some of the empty lots being developed for infill residences and others being developed as parks. Mount St. Vincent, a Catholic college on the northwestern tip of New York City, where the Bronx meets the Hudson Valley on the border of Riverdale and Yonkers. In this essay, I talk about the hidden cemetery inside this college campus, its unique architecture, and the site of its own train station that brought students and faculty from the train to the campus until the 1970s. Earlier, I also made an essay on the other side of New York City, down in the south in Staten Island, Miller Field, the city's last airport that had a grass-only runway used by the U.S. Navy and early Air Force during World War II, on the site of the former oak tree farm of the Vanderbilt family, whose wealth began on Staten Island. In this essay, I point out an abandoned hangar, an abandoned lighthouse, and the former airline landing lights in Miller Field, today part of the Gateway National Recreation Area, a national park site on Staten Island. Finial Destination, a very nice pun that talks about the finials, those decorations that appear on top of the bridges. This was the late City Island Bridge, which used to be a swing drawbridge, but kept in place for most of its history and demolished in the early years of this millennium in favor of a fixed span. When the historic City Island Bridge was removed, the finials were preserved in a triangular park on the City Island side of this new bridge. Lady of Loretto. There used to be a Catholic church in Brownsville, Brooklyn, this mostly black neighborhood, but this church was built by Italian immigrants in the early 20th century in the beautiful Renaissance Revival style. As the Italian population declined and Catholic attendance dwindled, the church felt that the upkeep of this building was too expensive, and so it was demolished in favor of affordable housing for the elderly at the Loretto residences. But if you know where to look, on the building's facade, inside its lobby, and at the entrance to its parking lot, where there's a statue of Mary inside a glass box for her own safety, are remnants of Our Lady of Loretto. Another Catholic landmark, that is still with us is off of the Whitestone Bridge approach from the Bronx side, where the Hutchinson River Parkway becomes the Whitestone Expressway, St. Joseph's School, a school for the deaf next to Monsignor Scanlon High School, a sizable Catholic campus next to a cemetery that was bisected by the expressway. But this building to me reminds me of the Chateau Frontenac of Quebec, or perhaps Professor Charles Xavier's School for the Gifted from the X-Men comic franchise. But it's still very much a functioning Catholic school next to an expressway on the Bronx side of the Whitestone Bridge. Nearby in the neighborhood of Soundview is a very beautiful mural by the Tats Crew, the Bronx's best-known graffiti crew turned commercial muralists, in memory of a paramedic Yadira Arroyo, as well as honoring Bronx-born Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor and the Bronx's role as the birthplace of hip-hop. This is next to the Morrison Avenue Soundview subway station on the elevated 6 train. If you look up, there's artworks on that station that honor the Siwanoy natives that lived in the eastern Bronx before colonization. There's also a bank next to the station that's askew to the street grid, because Soundview Avenue originally began here at the corner of Westchester Avenue by the train station, going to the tip of Clawson Point. Today, most of Soundview Avenue is to the south of the Bruckner Expressway, but this building and its skew to the grid reminds us of a street that used to be here. Alden Place, another example of a hidden Bronx cartography. It is a dead-end street, somewhere between Fordham and Tremont. Not in the best shape, but this street is a dead end. And the reason for that is because Mill Brook, a small stream that ran along the Bronx's Park Avenue and Webster Avenue down to Mott Haven, flowed near Alden Place, which is why it has a dead end, even though the stream hasn't flowed here in more than a century. Architectural gems. This essay takes us to Manhattan's Diamond District. It's just one block of 47th Street between 5th and 6th Avenues, where so much jewelry selling and trading takes place. But this essay focuses not just on its distinctive street furniture, like that diamond streetlight, but also architecture that includes Art Deco and Gothic Revival and everything from the early 20th century, and even before then, when there were brownstones on this block. The architectural gems of the Diamond District. Secrets of Van Cortlandt Mansion. The very beginning of the year 2023, I visited the Van Cortlandt Mansion, one of the Dutch colonial mansions built by descendants of New York's first white settlers. But this building also has a hidden history connecting to slavery in its attic. Notice no insulation, no heating on its top floor. And in the basement, a milestone from the Albany Post Road, the colonial name for Broadway, when it ran from the Battery in Manhattan to the city of Albany, with milestones telling you how far you were from the southern end and the northern end. Another essay I had at the very beginning of 2023 took me to a roundhouse in Eltingville, Staten Island, a couple of blocks from Raritan Bay. And I wasn't sure if this was a carousel or a former rail yard or trolley yard, but really this is a New York City Department of Environmental Protection water pumping station designed in a creative style towards the end of the previous millennial. Nearby is one of the few places in New York City that has homes on the waterfront of the ocean, because most of New York City's waterfront, especially on Staten Island, is public beaches and parks. But here, there are people who are willing to take the risk of storms from the ocean to have those unobstructed views. Going into 2022, just to give you a much quicker tour of the year before 2023, I visited in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn on Gates Avenue, a former synagogue that became a church that became a mosque. That's a couple of blocks from the original site of St. John's University before they moved to Queens in 1950. At the western end of the Coney Island Boardwalk, you'll find concrete that looks like wooden pavings, a controversial plan that was initially designed for all of the boardwalk, but local residents, elected officials, historical preservationists fought to keep the boardwalk boards of wood, but for that last couple of blocks on West 37th Street in Coney Island. In South Jamaica, I found a fading ad that appears to say something about Castoria, but also Castle Baths of Atlantic Beach. Back when Long Beach and Atlantic Beach used to have a lot of bathhouses, some of which have burned down or been demolished. So this is off of Sutphin Boulevard. Traces of pre-grid Bensonhurst, across from the Jewish Community House of Bensonhurst, the corner of Bay Parkway and the western end of Kings Highway. But if you look at the property lines and some of the alleys in Bensonhurst, You would learn that Kings Highway used to extend further west in colonial times towards Bay Ridge. Stable for now. Yes, there's the Merchant's House Museum in the East Village of Manhattan, but behind it there's also a dead-end stable court, a small alley that appears on the map, and a shaft that extends down to the city's third water tunnel, the city's deepest tunnel, that recently became a new park called Manuel Park, named after the city's early colonial Black residents, former slaves who achieved their freedom, as well as victims, those who were killed in the failed rebellions of 1712 and 1741 against slavery. Manuel Park, next to Stable Court and the Merchant's House Museum. Crown Heights Superblocks, dead-end streets designed by architect I.M. Pei. Brower Park, home to Brooklyn Children's Museum, and St. John's Park, which has an abandoned firehouse and a rec center with a beautiful mural on a super block in Crown Heights. My Little Newtown. The earliest colonial settlements of Queens were Flushing, Jamaica, and Newtown. Flushing is still on the map because all neighborhoods beginning with a 113 zip code, those are former villages and communities within Flushing. 114 is Jamaica. What about Newtown? Well, Newtown is less remembered because in 1897, Newtown was renamed Elmhurst to distance itself from the polluted reputation of Newtown Creek. And then after Elmhurst became part of New York City, it just became another neighborhood. Town Hall was demolished by 1966. There's very little history left in the downtown of Newtown, but for its colonial street lines, and a few old buildings, if you know where to look. Power at Lawrence Point, this sizable superblock that is the Astoria Power Plant, former country estate of the Woolsey and Lawrence families, descendants of English colonial settlers, all the way into the early 20th century. In this essay, I wasn't able to trespass onto the power plant, but I walked around its periphery to point out its history. Allen Key. This is Allen Street in Lower East Side Manhattan, which was widened in the 1930s to become an urban boulevard. And in the 1940s, the elevated subway line running above half of Allen Street was demolished, exposing it to sunlight. But when the street was widened, there was a couple of synagogues that were removed. This essay talks about the Romanian Jewish history of Allen Street, some of the old tenements here, a few kosher eateries, and the modern hotels popping up on this block that is now being redeveloped to look more like a boulevard with more benches and trees and flowers. Hiking Yellowstone, a street in the Forest Hills, Queens, given that name because of the cliffs and steep topography on both sides of Yellowstone Boulevard as it winds its way through the neighborhood. This is where I grew up as a child. Spaces along the Cross Bronx Expressway. In the 1950s, the Cross Bronx infamously sliced through the center of the Bronx, displacing thousands of residents. In this essay, I talk about the proposal to deck the highway with housing and parks, as well as some of the leftover spaces along the highway that were too small to be developed, that were turned into parks. Radically Center talks about Central Park's lost Center Drive. People know about the East Drive and West Drive that were recently closed to cars, but there was also a Center Drive that was closed to cars decades earlier. Today, the remnant of Center Drive is best known for its roller skating and volleyball. Bronx River Parkway surprise. Most of Bronx River Parkway in the Bronx runs through parkland, but there is a small part of it that runs above the Union Port subway yard, and there is a hidden sidewalk there that runs above the rail yard, creating a shortcut through this part of the Bronx. The village of Hempstead, built by English colonial settlers during the Dutch period. Its map, its layout, its history looks very similar to Jamaica, Queens. And this essay points out the similarities of Hempstead and Jamaica. Creedmoor, former rifle shooting range turned mental asylum that will soon be redeveloped into mixed housing development. In Creedmoor, I talk about this large superblock in eastern Queens and its architecture. PS 123 in Morningside Heights, Manhattan, a school built on a demapped portion of Morningside Park where a fort stood during the time of the War of 1812, anticipating a British invasion south from Canada that never came. Segments of Tompkins. Kevin Walsh grew up in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, and often writes about how the Gowanus Expressway and the Verrazano Narrow Bridge displaced residents and broke up the street grid. On the Staten Island side of the Verrazano Bridge, Tompkins Avenue was also broken up into pieces by this bridge, and I talk about those pieces. Approaching Queensboro, when my brother used to live in Long Island City, it was an exciting time. new glass towers popping up, but between them, there were still old labor union offices and small manufacturers. That's what this essay is about, as well as the expensive and controversial sculpture in the middle of Jackson Avenue by Ohad Meromi. The earliest times in 2022, I talked about the Brooklyn Terminal Market in Canarsie, a place for wholesale produce, and its original site, which became the expanded Brooklyn Navy Yard with its abandoned train tracks and dry docks and wharfs, with a very punny title, Giving Birth, because that's where the ships were laid in the dry docks. Halsey's Old Shore, the neighborhood of Astoria, Queens, was given its name by Stephen Halsey, a fur merchant, in honor of his friend, fellow merchant, John Jacob Astor the First. There would be four of them, a dynasty of wealth in America. But here we talk about Astoria Houses, a public housing complex on a peninsula where Halsey's mansion used to stand. It later became a school and it was then demolished in the early 1950s to make way for these NYCHA projects. And what's old is new. At the tip of Astoria, there used to be ferry service to Manhattan, discontinued in 1936 after the Triborough Bridge, and then revived in this millennium for NYC Ferry. Waterline Square, the first essay of 2022, takes us to where 59th Street meets West End Avenue near the Hudson River, where Midtown meets the Upper West Side. This development talks about the hidden train tracks underneath this site and a proposal for an underground highway that's yet to be realized on the West Side Highway. By the way, going back to my Halsey essay, I talk about a lighthouse that used to be at the tip of Astoria, which is now home to Whitey Ford Field, a baseball field named after a Yankee star who sang the blues, and some shipyards that have been abandoned and will soon be redeveloped into high-rise housing. Much of my experience in telling the history of New York City goes back to my college years at CCNY, New York City's oldest public college, this Gothic campus in the middle of Harlem Heights, or Hamilton Heights, surrounded by tenements and projects. This neo-Gothic style building famous for its tunnels and its belfry, and I got to explore all of that as a student, while also taking classes in architectural history. I paid my way through college as a licensed tour guide and a unionized tour guide on those gray lines New York sightseeing buses pointing fingers and buildings. From there on, I spent a few years working at New York City's tabloids, such as the Daily News and the New York Post, chasing ambulances and police cars for stories, and then worked for a few years for the city, as the city flag, which led to writing the book Hidden Waters of New York City about the streams under the streets and through the parks, while also writing for the Queens Jewish Link, the neighborhood newspaper for Queens, and teaching at Touro University classes in art history, American history, and Jewish history. I hope that all of this knowledge is useful and helpful to those who want to find the hidden aspects of the world's greatest city. And if you find this interesting, follow my videos, follow my blog, read my book, and I hope to provide more information in the future. Thank you.